Hello, I'm Iain McMenamin, Professor of Comparative Politics at Dublin City University, and this is a video about corruption and politics. I am going to set you exercises, ask you a few questions every now and again, and you may want to pause the video when I indicate there's an opportunity to do so, or you can just keep going, listening to me. Thanks. Okay, so here's our first scenario. Imagine a country called Ruritania. It's legal for business corporations to donate money to political parties. The government has recently proposed a new tax on mining, but the legislation has yet to be changed. A mining business donates €5,000 to a political party because the party offers a private meeting to all donors of €5,000 and over. At a meeting with the junior Minister of Finance, the company points out that a proposed new tax on mining firms would be very damaging to it. The government later decides not to go ahead with the new mining tax. How corrupt do you think this behaviour is? What's corrupt about this behaviour? What aspects, if any, are not corrupt? You may want to pause, have a think, and reread the scenario at this point. Okay. Well, let's make a few comments on this scenario. First of all, there's nothing illegal about this. So if you think corruption is about breaking the law, this is not corrupt. However, there are some aspects of it that many people will be uncomfortable with. It seems like the company has bought access to political decision makers. It also looks like that a meeting that was bought by the company has had an effect on government policy. And some people will think this is corrupt because money is buying influence. Here's a slightly different scenario. This time we're in a place called Novaya Zemlya. Here it's legal for business corporations to donate money to political parties. The government has recently proposed a new tax on mining, but the legislation has yet to be changed. A mining business donates €5,000 to a political party. A representative of the business meets an MP at a reception open to all attendees at the party's annual conference. She says the new mining tax may affect plans to develop an electric car business in the country, since the new industry could benefit from locally sourced lithium. The government later decides not to go ahead with the new mining tax. Again, how corrupt do you think this behaviour is? In what aspects is it corrupt, and in what aspects is it not corrupt? So you may want to pause again to have a think about how the questions relate to the scenario. Whether you've had a think by yourself or whether you've just kept going, let's make a few comments on this second scenario. Once again, it is legal to give money to political parties for private interests to do so. Again, we've got a tax on mining that has been proposed but not yet implemented. And again, we have a donation to a political party. This time, how the representative of the company and the politicians meet is a little bit different. They meet at a conference reception at a political party annual meeting. The representative of the company says, well, the new tax might be a problem for us because we're trying to develop an electric car industry, and this new mining tax might stop us using, or at least make it more difficult for us to use, locally sourced lithium. And in the end, again, the tax doesn't go ahead. Once again, it looks like private interests are using money to get into the political system. But there are some differences. The private interest doesn't literally buy a meeting with the politicians, and they don't seem to be lobbying just on behalf of their company, but maybe on behalf of a whole sector, the electric car sector, and the interests of the electric car sector perhaps are in the interest of the country as a whole because it might help reduce carbon emissions and help the country compete in a new important industry. So in that respect, many people would say this is not corrupt. Here's the third scenario. Sally has a degree in economics. She has been a member of the Liberal Party since university. She's also been an unpaid researcher and economics advisor for Mary, a member of Parliament, for 10 years. Sally works at an NGO where she earns €50,000 a year. Mary has recently been appointed Junior Minister for Finance. She has the legal right to appoint an advisor to a €150,000 post without a competition and offers the job to Sally. How corrupt is this behaviour? What aspects are corrupt? Which, if any, are not corrupt? You may want to pause and have a think at this point. Well, what did you think of this one? In some respects, Sally seems like an excellent candidate for this job. She's well qualified, she's got a degree in economics, she seems to have been working in irrelevant jobs for a long time. On the other hand, there's no competition for the job. And okay, Sally has a degree in economics, but maybe the main reason she's got the job is because she knows Mary and she's politically connected to Mary. And her salary is tripled. Some people would think this is corrupt, this is nepotism, giving jobs to your friends. Others would say, well, in politics, especially at the very top, you need to be able to appoint people that you can trust, people who are politically close to you, and therefore it's not appropriate to have an open political competition. What did you think? Here's the last scenario. Number 4. Bob owns a bar and has been a member of the Liberal Party for over 10 years. He regularly offers free food and drinks for events organised by the local branch of the Liberal Party. This Liberal Party has recently won control of the local town council, and Bob has been given a contract to provide catering services for official events in the local town hall. How corrupt is this behaviour? What aspects are corrupt? What aspects are not corrupt? You may wish to pause at this point. Okay, so let's talk about Bob and his catering contract with the local town hall. It seems pretty obvious that he has got the contract because he is connected to the local party and he has supported them over years. Maybe he serves great coffee, maybe his sandwiches are brilliant, we haven't been told. The reason he's got the job seems to be that he is connected to the local party. Is this corrupt? Is it wrong to support political parties? Is it wrong to be involved in the democratic process? Is it wrong to support the democratic process through your business by doing what you're best at? Maybe that's all fine, but maybe it's wrong that the contract is awarded on the basis of political preference rather than some more objective criteria like price or quality. This is another one of those scenarios where many people will see some corrupt elements and other people will think that much of this is fine. Well, thank you very much for enduring those 4 scenarios. If you're still here, you probably think there was some point to them, that they were stimulating and interesting, or maybe you're just curious what these seemingly pointless scenarios had to do with corruption and politics. In my opinion, they're pretty useful because they show us how difficult corruption is to define, but also they help us understand that corruption is a political phenomenon, and whether we find something corrupt or not depends on our notions of what's public and what's private, and most importantly, how those two connect So what is the appropriate balance or interface or interaction or engagement between private interests and the public interest? Obviously, the point of good politics pursues the public interest, however defined. But that, of course, is an aggregation of lots of private interests, and it's absolutely appropriate for politicians to be talking to business people and others about their private interests. And what we think is corrupt or not depends on how we think the public and the private should go together. Here's my definition of corruption. Corruption is the inappropriate use of the political system for private ends. You can disagree about the extent to which the previous scenarios were corrupt or not, and be okay with this definition. You can disagree about which aspects of the previous scenarios were corrupt or not corrupt, and still be okay with this definition. This is a definition that I think most citizens would agree makes sense. Some scholars and most lawyers wouldn't agree with it because it's too wide, it's too vague, and it doesn't help you decide whether something is illegal or unacceptable or not. Unfortunately, that's just the nature of corruption. It's a political phenomenon and it depends on our political views. The definition of corruption is subject to constant political debate, and it will vary over time and vary over space. Do not panic. This does not mean that we can't decide what's corrupt and what's not, and that we can't study corruption, as I'll explain as we go further. So we've talked about corruption in theory. Now we're going to talk about it in practice. And by its very nature, it's very hard to find. It's difficult to measure. It's difficult to know whether a country is more corrupt or least corrupt, or whether corruption is going up or down. The most widely used measure of corruption gets around some of these problems by using perceptions of corruption. It's called the Corruption Perceptions Index, and it aggregates at least 3 surveys of the perceptions of experts and or business people as to the level of corruption. So it's not down to the perception of just one particular group, and the groups that they survey are those who are supposed to be particularly well informed about actual corruption in a given country. Nonetheless, a lot of people say that the CPI is of little use because it does not relate accurately enough or directly enough to people's actual experience of corruption. Here's a graph that I prepared. It explores the relationship between the CPI, the Corruption Perceptions Index that I just introduced, and people's actual experiences of corruption as measured in a survey asking people whether they had paid a bribe in the previous 12 months. The CPI is on the Y or vertical axis, and the survey of people's experiences is on the X or horizontal axis. So maybe you'd like to pause here, take a look at the graph, and think about what, if anything, it tells you about the measurement of corruption. Well, overall, I think this graph is pretty good news for analysts and scholars of corruption, and pretty good news also for those who are trying to fight corruption, because it shows, broadly speaking, that as the perception of a country being more corrupt rises, so does the percentage paying a bribe. So this is good news in 2 respects. First of all, the perceptions, broadly speaking, seem to be accurate. And then secondly, we might think that the CPI and the survey of ordinary people are measuring two different levels of corruption. That the CPI is more about the elite level, where the experts and the business people might have direct experience or a good insight. And then the survey is, of course, not about the elite level. It's just about ordinary people maybe encountering corruption in the police or in the bureaucracy. So this graph suggests that the mass level and the elite level are very much related to each other. Of course, it's not always accurate for every country, and it has limitations in following changes over time. So for example, take a look at Lithuania on the bottom right. What do you think the graph says about Lithuania? Well, the key observation here is that there is a larger percentage reporting having paid a bribe in Lithuania, over 20%, than you would think by looking at its level of, on the Corruption Perceptions Index, of 60. So here it looks like the CPI, at least at the mass level, underestimates corruption in Lithuania. Then you might also look at somewhere like Uzbekistan at the very top of the graph there. So in Uzbekistan, you have under 15% reporting a bribe, but according to the CPI, it's the most corrupt of all these countries in Europe and Central Asia. So here it looks like the CPI is overestimating the amount of corruption. There are a few things that could be going on here, and this graph doesn't help us distinguish between them. So, for example, the elite and the mass level of corruption, they may be very different for Uzbekistan and Lithuania. So Lithuania may have relatively low elite corruption and relatively high level in terms of the experiences of ordinary people. That's perfectly possible, in which case Lithuania is accurately reported here. Then we might have the flip of that in Uzbekistan. Maybe the elites are really corrupt, but when going about your daily life, you only experience a moderate level of corruption. On the other hand, perhaps Uzbekistan is unfairly stereotyped as a corrupt society by those responding to the CPI. They're just not as well informed as the whole CPI methodology hopes they are. And maybe it's the other way around. Maybe in terms of the CPI, the people responding to that aren't that well informed. They think maybe because Lithuania is in Northern Europe and because it's a member of the European Union, it can't be that corrupt, and they haven't got this accurate, and in fact, there's a larger level of corruption than they're perceiving. So, although overall this graph is good news for analysts of corruption and anti-corruption campaigners, when we get down into the details, it shows the limitations of our attempts to measure corruption. There are also some really clever ways of measuring, of identifying corruption using official data. So not having to rely on perceptions or surveys of experience. A famous early example of this is Golden and Peachy's study of corruption in Italy, where they produce an index of how the level of corruption varied from region to region. So the way they do this is basically they can combine some data on how much the regional governments have spent on infrastructure, what they got for what they paid, how long the roads are, the length of bridges, etc., and then the costs of construction, so how much it would cost the private sector to build something. So then they say that they have an index of corruption, which is how much the government spent on this infrastructure, taking away what they actually got for the infrastructure and controlling for the costs of construction. So if there's a big difference between what they got and what they paid, Golden and Peachy say, okay, that extra cost then is corruption. So here's a map of Italy with the Golden Peachy corruption index overlaid onto it. And it goes region by region. Basically, the darker the region is, the more corrupt it is according to their index. And this map has what we would call face validity. It looks the way we would expect the map to look if the index were correct, because the parts of Italy which everybody agrees are more corrupt are more darkly colored. So they're down south. You'll see Sicily, SI, Calabria, CL, the toe of Italy. They have a dark color. In one sense, this means that the index doesn't necessarily tell you something that you didn't know already, but it has great potential because if you follow it over time, perhaps then you can see corruption go up or go down. And then also, there are some regions which are maybe a little bit darker than stereotypes might suggest. So look at Liguria up on the top left. So that is much darker than the areas around it. And maybe here the index was telling people something they didn't know already about the level of corruption in that area. Of course, this index would be impossible to exactly replicate for another country because it's using official data, and governments do things in slightly different ways from country to country. Nevertheless, the overall principle is one that you would think could be replicated for other societies. So far we've defined corruption, and we've also talked about how it can be measured, how it can be identified. Now we're going to go on and try to think about why are some societies more corrupt than others. So here, very broadly speaking, is how I think we would go about explaining why some societies are more or less corrupt than others. On the left, we have our outcome that we're trying to explain. That's corruption. And corruption equals 4 broad sets of factors that I think explains why some countries are more or less corrupt than others. And as we move from left to right, we get further away from corruption itself. We get into deeper explanations that are not directly connected to corrupt behavior. So let's begin with the one that's further left, anti-corruption measures. So these obviously are very close to the corrupt behavior that we're interested in. Next, we have concrete political institutions, and corruption being a political phenomenon, these are the institutions that could be corrupted. Next, we have political regimes, so basic fundamental ways of organizing politics. And then beyond that again, we have very broad and fundamental socioeconomic structures of a society. You might like to pause the video here and think about some specific factors that you think might fit under these 4 categories. Well, here are some examples I thought would fit under those 4 broad categories of factors that explain why some societies are more or less corrupt than others. Let's begin on the left under anti-corruption measures. Well, a really obvious one here is to have an anti-corruption unit or an anti-corruption bureau of some sort. Another one, which is very popular in Europe, is to have public funding of politics. So then political parties and individual candidates have a lower incentive to seek money from rich people or from businesses that might lead to corruption. Continuing with that theme, you could also have regulation of political finance, so that politicians and parties would have to report on their finances. There might also be limits on how much money could be given to them, or bans on donations. And then we get to asset disclosure. So this goes even further and says, all right, politicians have to disclose their private assets. So in case the channel of corruption is not through political parties or through political activity, but is actually for the gain of individuals. And then another really important one is transparent tenders, so that if the state is going to spend some money on products or services, that the competition is transparent and the way the contract is awarded is transparent and fair. And it's difficult for people to short circuit that by bribery or through political favoritism. So for example, maybe if the tenders had been more transparent in Italy for infrastructure, you wouldn't see such big differences in the golden and peachy index across the regions of Italy. Okay, so they're anti-corruption measures. Then we could go on to political institutions. And here, in the first instance, I'm talking about the political institutions of democracy. And democracy can be organized in some really different ways. So most obviously in terms of executive-legislative relations. So you have presidential regimes where the president, the head of the executive, is directly elected and is separate to the legislature. Whereas you also then have parliamentary regimes where the executive and the legislature aren't really separate. You don't have a separate election for the chief executive. Rather, you just have legislative elections, and then whichever candidate can get a majority of the parliament, of the legislature, that they can then get the job of chief executive. Another variation, important variation, is in terms of the electoral system. So that's the formula you use to convert votes into seats in the executive or the legislature. And you can, broadly speaking, you can have proportional systems, or you can have first past the post. So in a first past the post system, you may not even get a majority of votes, you just get more than any other candidate, and you get the office. So it's a winner takes all. Then moving ahead to political regimes, you can think about really fundamental differences like democracy versus non-democracy. Or you can have a free press versus a media system which is controlled and dominated by the government. And we've mentioned the executive and the legislature already. An independent judiciary could be very important for reducing corruption. And then finally, we get to socioeconomic structures. So big differences like how wealthy countries are, how diversified their economies are, and the level of inequality within a country. Okay, I am going to sum up for you a massive and complicated literature. I'm going to oversimplify to some extent, but I think I'm going to give you some rough insight into how far scholars have got in terms of trying to think about the relative importance of these sets of factors. And here is what my reading of the literature is. And it is that the two sets of regimes on the right are shown to be consistently important in explaining whether countries are corrupt or not, whereas the two on the left, the two that are actually closer to corrupt behavior itself, anti-corruption measures and political institutions, really there's a lot of debate and not much consensus, and it's difficult to show whether any of these things make a difference. It's now 29 minutes into this video. I'm amazed, flattered, I'm very grateful that you're still here. I'm almost finished. I apologize if this has been boring or confusing, and I apologize because I haven't got a punchline, which is sort of obvious because I'm an academic and we're talking about something really complicated. But I do hope that I have some conclusions, however tentative for you. And the conclusion, which maybe you've anticipated, is that I think corruption is political. It's deeply political. It is not a technical problem that can be easily solved. And this is the reason, I think, on the previous slides, where those explanations which were closer to corruption, especially those explanations which were targeted at corruption, like anti-corruption measures, like having an anti-corruption bureau, or transparency of tenders, etc., that these things can't and don't make a huge difference unless there is political support behind them, right? There's no point in having an anti-corruption bureau if the politicians that appointed the people in it are corrupt themselves. So maybe in an unusual situation where the politicians, so the elites running the country, are clean and you have a problem lower down of petty corruption, that's a situation where technical fixes can work. But more often, unfortunately, in order to reduce or solve corruption, profound political change is needed, often something which is akin to regime change. Thanks very much for listening.